friends, it's finally October, and that means that it's no longer incredibly socially inept and awkward to talk about horror stories anymore, which means we're going to take full advantage of that by talking about, well, one of the greatest horror stories of all time, that being Night of the Living Dead, except there's a twist this time, because we're not talking about a movie, although we'll probably be looking at the film since it's in the public domain and I can steal as much of it as I want, but we're going to be looking instead at a novel. That is, a novelization of Night of the Living Dead. Now, unlike a lot of other novelizations that are basically attempts to make a cheap buck by prosifying a screenplay, this one is a little bit different because it's written by Mr. John A. Russo. Now, who is John A. Russo? Well, for one thing, he is one of the original screenwriters for Night of the Living Dead, along with George A. Romero. For another thing, he also wrote Return of the Living Dead. That is the book, not the film, which is, as far as I know, very, very different from Russo's own original ideas. In any case, we're talking about a guy who knows the story because he wrote the story. And exactly how much of it he wrote, we're going to get into in just a second. Russo explains right here in the preface to the story that he and George worked on writing the story together. Now, exactly how much did Russo do? To hear his own account of it, he basically did most of it. The concept came from George Romero, but Russo gave a lot of the rest of it. He really wrote the rest of it. So, Russo explains in his preface that the original script of Night of the Living Dead came out of a synthesis of his and George Romero's ideas and the need to work in a strictly constrained budget. They came up with ideas of a horror comedy involving aliens coming down from space, but the SFX were just far too expensive. And then they started thinking about other horror tropes that they could use as an idea. George came up with a 40-page long treatment of a story where humanoid monsters begin attacking and killing people, similar to the voodoo zombies of old who strangled or beat their victims to death. What Russo added was a motive for the monsters. He had wanted to write a story about flesh eating monsters, and this, combined with Romero's ideas, created the modern zombie. I should note that the preface here by John Russo and the 1974 introduction by George Romero, also included in this book, seem to be at odds with each other. George does not directly credit John for coming up with the flesh eating idea. He seems to imply that he got it from reading I Am Legend. Regardless, it does appear that Russo was primary writer for the screenplay, taking George's story and expanding it into a screenplay and a film script. This left Russo, a novelist as well as a filmmaker, with ample material for writing an official novelization. Now, a word on film novelizations. Film novelizations are usually based off of a screenplay, not off of an actual film. This is because the novelization usually releases either at the same time as the movie or ideally a little bit before the movie is released. This happened with Star Wars, for example, among others. Anyways, we're already off to a good start when one of the two masterminds behind the film is the author of the official novelization. Sometimes, as in the case of my beloved Alien, the novelization of a screenplay is handed off to an author of some renown, in this case, of course, Alan Dean Foster. Sometimes, as in the novelization of Dawn of the Dead, the screenplay is given to an author of considerably less skill, and the product that results is underwhelming. It is, of course, quite rare that the novelization is made by one of the original authors, but writing a novel is distinctly different from writing a film, and I was skeptical that Russo's novel would carry the same power as the movie. Thankfully, I'm here to tell you that Russo's adaptation, while not necessarily perfect, is in fact an excellent adaptation of the film. In fact, I would go so far as to say that if you have watched the original Night of the Living Dead, you probably owe it to yourself to read this book as well. It's a wonderful retelling of the same story. It is beat for beat, basically the exact same story as the film. A woman named Barbara loses her brother to an assault by a ghoul in a graveyard while visiting her father's grave. She flees for her life to an abandoned farmhouse, where she's soon joined by a man named Ben, whose truck is running on fumes. Ben dispatches some ghouls and sets about fortifying the house against the inevitable attack of the undead. Slightly later, he discovers that the house's cellar is being used as a refuge by five other survivors: Harry and Helen, their sick daughter Karen, and teenagers Tom and Judy. Harry selfishly hides out in the cellar, refusing to help the other survivors, while Tom and Judy try their best to assist Ben in trying to refuel the truck and escape, all while Barbara switches back and forth from catatonia and manic attempts to escape the house to find her now long dead brother. Things don't end well for anyone. Now, I'm going to take a look at the first chapter of this book to give you guys an idea of how it's presented to you. Basically, as I said, there aren't many differences from the film, but where there are differences, they're quite striking and interesting. If the plot is practically identical to the film, what is there to say about the novel? In short, it's all in presentation. The slight differences in events and the nuances of the narration are what really makes this adaptation shine at points. Our narration begins with our unidentified, presumably omniscient narrator musing about the nature of life and death. He asks why humans fear death and wonders why life is so significant when we are living, but so trivial after our lives are done. Life smolders a while and then dies, and the graves wait patiently to be filled, and the end of all life is death, and the new life sings happily in the breeze, and neither knows nor cares about the old life, and then it in turn dies also. Life is a constant turning over into graves. Things live and then die, and sometimes they live well and sometimes poorly, but they always die, and death is the one thing that reduces everything to the least common denominator. Russo is planting the seeds of the narrative here, where this natural order will be overthrown for something completely unnatural. Death will no longer be the end, at least in some ways. The narrator muses further about what would happen if we were able to meet the dead. Would they be friends or enemies? And will we be able to conquer them if we have never conquered our fear of death? This bit feels tacky and cheesy in my opinion. I don't really mind it too much, but it does feel cliche to say something like this. Would the dead be our enemies? I mean, yeah, clearly I've seen the cover of the book. I've seen the back cover of the book. I've seen the movie. I know what I'm getting into here. Anyways, as we begin the story proper, we see some interesting details. Johnny drives angrily to the cemetery, and he is vindictive towards Barbara. He had not turned off the engine yet, and Barbara immediately guessed why. He wanted her to suffer a while longer in the heat of the car, to impress upon her the fact that he had not wanted to make this trip in the first place, and that he held her responsible for all their discomfort. Russo gives us insight into Barbara and Johnny's mindset at the time they enter the cemetery, fleshing out their characterization in the film. Johnny is frustrated and exhausted from a 3-hour drive and 2 hours of delay as they become lost on the way to the cemetery. He is not in a good frame of mind. I like that Johnny's mere complaining in the film here is expanded into petty acts of vengeance. It's a nice detail that gives Johnny a somewhat more malicious streak. Here's another thing that the novel gives us that the film never could without some extremely aggravating expositionary dialogue. It establishes the characters' ages. Johnny, it turns out, is only 26, and Barbara is only 19. We will later meet Tom and Judy, who are only 16 years old. Making several of the characters so young is an excellent choice on Russo's part. It explains a lot about their behavior, such as their fear and their impulsiveness, which will become key to the story. It makes us care a little bit more about them all as well, I think, knowing that these characters are not even fully grown, especially in the case of Tom and Judy. It adds this kind of horror, maybe parental fear for some older readers. I definitely feel like making Barbara so young also helps to justify her famously helpless behavior throughout the story. We learn about the resentment that Johnny feels for being here, while Barbara lays a plastic wreath upon their father's grave. It's basically the same as the film. Things continue as they do in the film. However, Johnny distinctly notices someone moving in the darkness. In the film, he does this too, but it's basically broad daylight. In the distance, a strange moving shadow appeared almost as a huddled figure moving among the graves. There was definitely someone in the distance, moving among the graves. Johnny squinted, but it was too dark to make out anything but an indistinct shape that more often than not blurred and merged with the shape of the trees and tombstones as it advanced slowly through the graveyard. The addition of Johnny seeing this shadowy figure is excellent for building suspense. In the film, Johnny sees the man lumbering through the cemetery clear as day, clearly a bit curious as to the man's demeanor. He's unable to tell that the man is a zombie, probably because he looks more or less just like a normal man. In the novel, the exact appearance of the man is left mercifully obscured and mysterious. We are allowed to imagine some kind of hideous deformities if we so choose. Johnny, still upset with his sister, decides to mock her fear of the cemetery from her childhood. He lets out a line that will be familiar to almost all horror fans, if somewhat modified. "He's coming to get you, Barbara. He's dead, and he's going to get you," while gesturing to the lone man with them in the cemetery. As Barbara goes to apologize to the man, we learn that this man is, of course, not what he appears. In the darkness, neither of them were able to make out the look of him. Unlike in the original film, where the scene feels as though it happens in broad daylight, again, Barbara even remarks that it is very light outside for being 8 p.m. In the book, we are told it is a much darker place. This lumbering man is a mere outline in the darkness. I can't tell you how much I love this change. It makes the mere act of Barbara approaching the man that much more frightening as he is obscured in shadow. Granted, the film has its own strength in the attack being completely unforeseen due to the man's very human appearance, but I prefer the novel in this respect. It's just eerie and creepy. Then the attack commences. It is just as immediate and violent as it is in the film, but I loved Russo's description of the attack. Here it is. And suddenly the man grabbed Barbara around the throat and was choking her and ripping at her clothes. She tried to run or scream or fight back, but his tight fingers choked off her breath, and the attack was so sudden and so vicious that she was nearly paralyzed with fear. Johnny came running and dived at the man and tackled him, and all three fell down, Johnny pounding at the man with his fists, and Barbara kicking and beating with her purse. Soon Johnny and the man were rolling and pounding at each other, while Barbara, screaming and fighting for her life, was able to wrench free. The freedom of prose compared to film allows Russo to make this struggle more interesting than it is in the movie. The zombie is described as thrashing like a wild animal, biting and clawing at Johnny's hands and neck. We are able to see much more clearly the impulse of the zombie to devour its opponent, to try and eat Johnny even as he still lives. The book gives a much more striking image of the fight. Barbara sees only the outlines of the two combatants as they struggle, both standing up and on the ground. It has become so dark that she cannot make out who is winning the fight. Eventually, one of the two combatants gains the advantage, and in a brief outline against the dark sky, Barbara saw him slam his fists down on the other's head. Barbara arms herself with a branch and approaches closer. The man on top continues to slam his fists down with a heavy, dull thud and the sound of cracking bone. Barbara stopped in her tracks. The figure on top had a rock and was using it to smash his enemy's brain. God, I love the description here. It is so much more visceral and violent than anything implied in this scene in the film. The zombie is using its bludgeon to bash open Johnny's head and kill him. I always thought it was interesting how Knight's zombies seem to have a certain level of intellect. They know how to use basic tools, and they also know how to kill by targeting the head and various other weak points on the human body. They will kill their target instead of simply biting if it makes it easier for them to gain sustenance. This is certainly the case in the novel as well as the film. What happens next I love even more, as it captures the essence of the zombie far better than the graveyard scene in the film. Barbara watches in horror as her brother's head is stove in with the rock, perhaps mercifully obscured by the darkness. Immediately after the stone has done its work, the ghoul drops it and begins to fulfill its only purpose: consumption of living flesh. Barbara braced herself with her tree branch, ready to use it as a club, but the attacker did not rise. He continued to kneel over the vanquished body. Barbara heard strange ripping sounds, and she could not see clearly what the attacker was doing, but the ripping sounds continued in the night, ripping, ripping, as if something was being torn from Johnny's dead body. She was in such a state of extreme shock that she was near death, and all she could hear was ripping, ripping, as the attacker wrenched and pulled at her brother's dead body. And yes, she saw in a fresh shaft of moonlight through a passing cloud that the attacker was sinking his teeth into Johnny's dead face. This is such an excellent introduction to what the zombie is, something the film and even its 1990 remake does not give us, at least not at the start. At first, it would seem that the goal of the ghoul is only to kill. After all, in the original film, the cemetery zombie immediately pursues Barbara, whereas in the novel, he needs to be distracted from his meal by Barbara approaching him and sobbing. The pursuit that follows is just as frantic as in the film. The zombie moves with surprising speed, its hunger driving it to chase Barbara as fast as its rigid body can go. But this scene establishes the zombie as flesh eaters first and foremost, driven by that insatiable hunger for human flesh, and describes in so brutal a way the devouring of Johnny's face, sharing the same fate as the corpse Barbara will later encounter inside the house. I hope that my description of the first chapter has given you a taste of Russo's style and why I think it works perfectly to retell Night of the Living Dead in a fresh and interesting way. Now, I want to turn to a more general discussion of how the zombies are handled in this novelization and how effectively it displays the horror of the undead menace. For one thing, the description of zombies as rotten corpses is fantastic in this book, and without the budgetary limitations of the film, we're able to get a much better idea of Romero and Russo's ideal zombie. As one zombie breaks into the house later in the story, Ben battles with it, and we're given a physical description of its appearance. The dead thing that Ben began struggling with this time was more horrible looking than the other two, as if it had been dead longer and had died a more terrible death. Patches of hair and flesh had been torn from its head and face, and the bones of its arms showed through the skin like a jacket with the elbows worn through, and one dead eye was hanging halfway out its socket, and its mouth was twisted and caked with blood and dirt. These kinds of visuals would be achieved in Day of the Dead and earlier in Fulci's Zombie 2, but were absent in the original Night of the Living Dead due to budgetary constraints. On the one hand, I really do like the more human appearance of Night of the Living Dead zombies in the film. Since this is relatively soon after the outbreak starts, it makes sense that many of the zombies might look more or less like recently deceased people who died of natural causes. Nonetheless, this is a welcome addition, as seeing some zombies in states of decay and mutilation really helped to sell the concept of the living dead, which again would have been new to Russo's readers when this was released in 1968. As in the film, the zombies are pushovers individually. They're physically weaker than your average man, but demonstrate feats of insane durability. Johnny is overpowered by the zombie in the cemetery, largely because he does not understand that the blows he delivers to the ghoul's body is worthless. Johnny wastes his energy on ineffective blows rather than focusing on grappling with the zombie, and his stamina gives out against the zombie's endless endurance. Ben, on the other hand, is able to target the head with a tire iron and dispatches several zombies early in the story, but I should note that it is with much more difficulty than he lets on. Russo describes his panting and sobbing as he caves in the heads of each zombie, the physical and mental strain clearly being immense. Again, the book does a better job of portraying this than the film. Russo includes many excellent descriptions of the undead being's durability. What I like most about it is that he describes how they are completely unmoved by pain, but do recoil in fear from fire. When Ben throws a burning zombie corpse outside the house, he observes the reaction of the zombies. Ben watched the three beings in the yard as they stepped back slightly, trying to cover their faces with their stiff arms, as though they were afraid of fire. Compare the reaction to fire with the reaction to being attacked with weapons. As Ben and Tom are trying to barricade the windows, they are being assaulted from the other side by grasping hands. Both the man and the teenage boy attempt to fight back the hands of the dead, but with little success. The man smashed with the rifle butt against the ugly extremities. Once, twice, the rifle butt stamped down on the decaying hands, driving one of them back with the shattering of the already broken glass it had been reaching through. The rifle butt smashed another of the hands against the window molding solidly, but the hand, unfeeling of any pain, continued to claw after a hold. Russo makes it very clear, actually much more clear than in the film, that the zombies do not react to physical blows any more than just being moved by the force exerted against them. They do not recoil or retreat from what would cause most humans pain. Tom has a similar problem dealing with the undead. Tom leaped against the barricaded window and seized the rotting wrist with both his hands and tried to bend the wrist back in an effort to break it, but it seemed limp and almost totally pliable. He tried to scrape the cold thing against the edge of the broken glass, and the absence of blood was immediately evident in an appalling way as the sharp edge of the broken glass ripped into what looked like rotting flesh. We see the strange pliability of the monsters. They don't even resist attempts to break their limbs. Their single minded advance is towards only the goal of consuming flesh. Nothing else matters. The zombies show interesting behaviors and once again a semblance of intelligence. In chapter 2, Barbara observes the attacker moved toward the new man, and Barbara did not know what to expect next. She froze against the door and glanced down at her knife, then looked back out at the two men. They joined each other, seemingly without exchange of words, under the dark, hanging trees, and stood quietly, looking back toward the cemetery. The zombies seem to have some kind of instinct other than hunger. They naturally congregate with one another, almost as if they have some knowledge that their chances of catching food improves with greater numbers. Now, there are some elements that seem to contradict the earlier depiction of the dead, unfearing of pain and death, closer to the end of the book. As McClellan, the sheriff, and his men are clearing out the undead, a bizarre change occurs in the zombies' behavior. The posse advanced in squads across the field and toward the shed with the gasoline pumps, where several of the flesh eaters were lurking and trying to get away, but they were gunned down. There were more of the creatures trying to hide in and around a burned out truck, but they were unsuccessful. They tried to run, but the posse gunned them down. They tried to run! Why this sudden change in behavior? Why is Russo suddenly giving these creatures self preservation instincts that we never saw in the film? This decision somewhat baffled me, and it left me wondering if it was a survival from an earlier version of the story where the zombies had more individual agency. At the same time, the idea that zombies can learn self preservation behaviors was established in Day of the Dead, almost 20 years after the publication of this novel. I think I could chalk it up to some early weirdness in the portrayal of the zombies, right? This was our first attempt at portraying them. But it also seems to contradict Russo's own earlier writing in the book. However, I think I have a solution here. We recall that earlier in the story, the zombies do not immediately pursue the protagonists and attack the house. No, most of them only attack once they have overwhelming numbers on their side. There seems to be a kind of group instinct, a collective wisdom to them in Night of the Living Dead. The zombies are not as brainless as they appear. It seems that, in Russo's version at least, the zombies actually do have some kind of intelligence or animal instinct to survive, which is overridden only when they possess a great advantage in numbers or are driven by the promise of easy prey. I kind of like this interpretation of them, even if it doesn't gel very well with later renditions of the Romero zombie. Now, as I mentioned before, the plot of the novel is practically identical to the film, but there are additions to the story. For one thing, the news broadcasts that the characters listen to are a bit more frequent and provide some more specific information. In the film, they're usually used as background noise for much of the story, giving interesting details to the listener. These broadcasts serve to make the government response to the disaster seem measured and actually quite adequate. In fact, it's even better than it is in the film. Military and police forces do practically everything right. The radio tells people to seek shelter in urban areas, as isolated rural residences are likely to be overwhelmed. In the film, civil defense forces are manning posts with medical aid. But the novel takes this a step further. National Guard forces are quickly being deployed to motorways to secure the retreat of rural residents into cities and towns. People are being directed to destroy the brain or light the undead on fire if possible, and are advised to shelter in place only if immediately surrounded. Police and vigilante units are in the process of combing remote areas in search and destroy missions against all aggressors. All in all, Russo's rendition would imply that humanity might be able to deal with this unexpected global catastrophe, at least in some parts. The reports also have a really interesting role in foreshadowing the ending of the story, as the reporter says, "Citizens are urged to remain in their homes. Those who ignore this warning expose themselves to intense danger from the aggressors and from armed citizenry, whose impulse may be to shoot first and ask questions later." I do love the foreshadowing here as it relates to Ben's death. Of course, for us as modern readers, this will come off as some kind of dramatic irony instead of foreshadowing. We already know that Ben is going to die, but now we know that the method of his death was already predicted earlier in the story. It works quite well in any case, and establishes that human beings may still be the most dangerous thing in this scenario. The news broadcasts also establish a few things about the outbreak. The connection to the radiation from the Venus probe is made, but is questioned as well, as the outbreak of the undead seems to be the strongest in the Midwest, at least within the United States, not the coastline where the probe fell. I'm not really sure why Russo chose to include this detail, as we know that the outbreak is global, perhaps worldwide. Why would there be a specific place more heavily affected that was not part of the origin point? How could the point of origin be in one particular place when it seems to be happening all across the world at the same time? I do question this writing decision. Nonetheless, the news broadcasts do a good job of establishing that bites and open wounds caused by the zombies quickly result in death and reanimation, as it does in the film. Basically, within a few minutes, reanimation will occur. Sheriff McClellan has an expanded role in the book. There's even a chapter focused entirely on him and his ragtag posse. McClellan first appears on the television, his men dispatching zombies and throwing their corpses into massive fires. McClellan describes the situation as follows: "There ain't no problem, except just getting to them before they kill off all the people that are trapped. We ain't lost nobody or suffered no casualties. All you gotta do is shoot for the brain. We're doing our best, but we only got so many men and a whole lot of open country to comb." McClellan's addition as a protagonist in the latter half of the novel adds an interesting element of hope that did not exist in the film. Again, if we imagine ourselves as readers of this story in 1968 without having seen the film, this would provide the hope for rescue for our main characters. By the end of chapter 10, it is clear that McClellan intends to lead his men to the farmhouse by noon of the following day. The reader might think, had they not already seen the film, that McClellan and his men will save Ben, Harry, Helen, and Barbara if they can only hold out long enough. Once again, for an audience familiar with the film, it can only serve as dramatic irony. We know that McClellan will ultimately be responsible in some way for the last surviving hero's death. However, this character's involvement could also be seen as a hint at an older plot element ultimately not preserved in the novel or the film, an ending wherein McClellan and his men successfully rescue Barbara, at least, which was part of the original plans for the film before Romero and Russo agreed to change it for a more grisly ending. I really liked the addition of the McClellan scenes. It adds yet another level of dark, twisted irony to the story. McClellan is pushing his militiamen hard, doing his damnedest to save all the people that he can, and meeting with some success. But he will ultimately be partly responsible for Ben's death. In this version, Ben is killed by an anonymous posse member, whom McClellan quickly chastises for not checking to see if it was a person first. However, his death is still completely overlooked, and he is viewed as just another zombie to be put on the fire. So, on to the conclusion. John A. Russo's novelization of Night of the Living Dead is actually a quick and enjoyable read. Despite following the events of the film very closely, it succeeds as an interesting zombie story in its own right. However, I wouldn't want to experience it in a vacuum outside of the film, which bears the same name. Rather, it's a wonderful companion piece to the film. It differs just enough in details to be interesting, and its narration is detailed and precise. Russo's depiction of the undead deserves high praise, as he succeeds in making the zombies of Night of the Living Dead truly terrifying, whereas their visual presentation in the original film was somewhat lacking, even if all of their actions were quite terrifying. Readers will find this interpretation of the events of the film to be at once imaginative and effective, and his characterization of figures such as Ben, Harry, Barbara, and Johnny do add some new depth to the film, even though I would really like to see more interior thoughts of characters like Ben and Barbara. It was especially a missed opportunity to show what Barbara's mind was like while she was going through her fits of madness. Unlike the rather lackluster Dawn of the Dead novelization, this one absolutely receives my stamp of approval. If you want to experience Night of the Living Dead through the medium of prose, this is probably the best way to do it. I should note, there are a ton of books out there called Night of the Living Dead because of the fact that the copyright is basically open. But you want to look for a copy of the story by John A. Russo specifically. This is, after all, his story. The film and the novel are both, in many ways, his brainchild. So if there's any version that you should be reading, it's this one.